Today I thought about the French Revolution again. How the cost of bread and a tennis court caused a revolution. I know it sounds too funny to be textbook history, but let me explain. Before we dive into the revolution, let's recap the previous video where I gave the build-up. I do recommend that you check out the previous video to understand the build-up of this revolution. I'll leave the link in the description and somewhere here. Now, things were not going well for France, but then they got even worse. A series of harsh summers and winters left the peasants' harvest in ruin. People had no money or food, and the cost of bread skyrocketed. The upper classes had massive stocks of wheat and grain, so they were virtually unaffected by the famine. But the poor really were starving, and people began to protest. Women took to the streets, bakeries were raided, and bakers suspected of keeping bread for themselves were sometimes even hanged.
Where is our bread? You hoard it while we starve.
Yes, the French do have a flair for taking everything just a bit too far. The Third Estate realized that any attempt by them to reform the system would just be vetoed by the other two estates. And so they decided to make their own government, make their own laws, and take over the running of the country.
Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
The leaders of the Third Estate would meet at a certain location frequently to discuss ideas and decide on what to do next. The king decided to stop this by locking up their meeting place and hoping that they would go back to starving at home. Yes, the king thought that if you lock up one place, they would just go back home and starve. The people instead found a nearby tennis court and gathered there. On June 20th, 1789, they took the tennis court oath, pledging to continue meeting until the king gave in to their demands for more equality and economic reform. This new National Assembly included many of the most educated members of the Third Estate, including two young lawyers by the names of Maximilien Robespierre and George Danton. Make sure to remember the Robespierre guy, he is interestingly important. Some members formed a new radical political party called the Jacobin Club, and a growing number in the Jacobin faction started calling for something even crazier, the removal of the king entirely. The king started to fear, and hence he stationed military around Paris. Seeing this, the public started to fear the king's response, and here you can see the fear triangle. The people fear that the king will not do any reforms and they will starve. So they protest. The king is afraid that the protest will turn into riots and he will be overthrown. So he stationed the military around Paris. The people are now afraid that the military will kill them all. Panic. The National Assembly created a bourgeoisie militia, or the National Guard, and many troops from the French military defected over to the revolutionary side. See, many of the military people were not exactly poor, but they weren't exactly rich either. So they started to sympathize with the revolutionaries. And they looked at the revolutionaries like, we were the revolution. In the early hours of July 14, 1789, a large crowd stormed and raided the Hotel Les Invalides, where they secured the rifles, but no gunpowder. This did present a minor problem, but the crowd knew that there was gunpowder at the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison fortress and a symbol of the royal tyranny. Mid-morning, the crowd gathered around the Bastille and demanded that Governor Delaunay hand over the gunpowder and surrender the prison. To which Governor Delaunay said, no. He instead decided to stall for time by inviting a few members from the crowd inside the Bastille for negotiations.
Sneaky little witches. Wicked, tricksy, false.
The crowd saw through the governor's tricks and decided to storm the fortress and take on the French troops inside. Governor Delaunay was killed and his head was put on a pike. There were a few people around this time that were fueling this revolution and advocating for violence. One of the major advocates for violence was Jean-Paul Marat, a man of science who had a horrible skin condition that confined him to a bathtub. He wrote a radical newspaper called The Friend of the People. His message: citizens of France, be very afraid. Given the chance, the king and the nobility won't hesitate to massacre us all. The solution is simple. It is something that I cannot say here on YouTube. This dude was the OG agitator on Twitter. His newspaper became one of the most popular publications in Paris during the revolution, and it succeeded in spreading ever more fear and anger amongst the public. Because France. In August, leaders of the National Assembly, with help from a certain Thomas Jefferson, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It was an incredible document that guaranteed liberty and equal rights to all men. And when I say men, I do mean men. Now, the people wanted to create a permanent constitution, but during the constitutional negotiations, the monarchists, or the other two estates, were able to secure a legislative veto for the king. Following the mutiny of the French guards a few hours before the storming of the Bastille, the only troops immediately available for the security of the palace at Versailles were the aristocratic guard corps, the bodyguards, and the Cent Louis, the 100 Swiss. Both of these were primarily ceremonial units and therefore lacked the numbers and proper training to provide effective protection for the royal family and the government. Feeling the need for additional security, the king ordered the Flanders Regiment to Versailles in late September 1789 as a precautionary measure. From the perspective of the people, it did not look good. Flanders Regiment was a regular infantry regiment of the Royal Army. On 1st October, the officers at Versailles held a welcoming banquet for the officers of the newly arrived Flanders Regiment. It was described in the newspapers with a vulgarity so remarkably French. During the banquet, someone picked up a tricolor cockade and threw it on the ground and stomped on it, as one does, and people in the crowd quickly joined in and started chanting, "Down with the tricolor cockade." And drunk officers started swearing their allegiance solely to the white cockade of the House of Bourbon. On the morning of 5th October, a young woman struck a marching drum near the edge of a group of market women who were infuriated at the high price and shortage of bread. A lot of people joined in, mostly women, and a lot of them were bearing kitchen knives and other makeshift weapons. The mob then went to the City Hall of Paris where they demanded not only bread but arms. The crowd at this point was estimated to be about 7,000 people. The crowd then proceeded to travel the distance from Paris to Versailles in about 6 hours. Amongst their makeshift weaponry, they were also dragging several cannons which they had taken from the City Hall of Paris. This mob was further fueled by the theory that it was an aristocratic plot to intentionally withhold food from the poor for the benefit of the aristocrats, which wasn't really a theory, it was kind of true. The people felt that the king simply couldn't see their problems because he lived in Versailles, a full 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. So they wanted to bring the king back home, and they spoke much less affectionately about the queen. The king had been out hunting and had only just returned to the palace, and with few other options available to him, the president of the assembly, this guy, accompanied a deputation of market women into the palace to see the king. A group of 6 women, nominated from the crowd, were then escorted into the king's apartments, where they told the king about the crowd's privations. The king was apparently so charming that one of the women fainted at his feet. After this brief but pleasant meeting, arrangements were made to disperse some food from the royal stores, with more promised. However, most people were not satisfied with this, so they milled about. Things got much worse when the queen forced the king to break any promises that he had made. By the next morning, it was clear that the National Guards and the diverse civilian demonstrators from Paris and Versailles townships had formed a vigorous alliance. At around 6 o'clock in the morning, some of the protesters, who at this point were mostly male, discovered a small unguarded gate to the castle, and the crowd was now determined to murder the queen. A surprised guard fired on the crowd before he was killed by them, and a second guard was able to warn the queen before he too was murdered. The crowd paraded the severed heads of the murdered guards on pikes, but the queen escaped. Running barefoot from her chambers, Marie Antoinette shouted for someone to save her children and ran in search of them. She took refuge in the king's apartment. This is the point of the famous misconception where Marie Antoinette apparently said, "Let them eat cake." She never actually said it. Before the crowd could do any harm to the royal family, they were stopped by the National Guardsmen under the command of this guy. Hooch's men spirited away the royal family to safety, while the crowd paraded around with the severed heads of the 2 murdered guards. At this point, Lafayette was woken and rushed to the aid of the royal family. The fact that he had been sleeping during such a violent affair would stain his previously celebrated reputation, as Paris newspapers would call him General Morpheus, referencing the Greek god of sleep. He looked around and told the royal couple that they had to greet the crowd from atop a balcony to appease the people. With comforting words from the general, the queen stepped onto the balcony alongside the king and her children. The crowd's reaction at first was lukewarm, until Lafayette, ever the showman, pinned a tricolor cockade in the hat of a royal bodyguard, and then he bowed and kissed the hand of Marie Antoinette. This performance paid off, as the crowd wildly applauded and started chanting "To Paris." The king, it seemed, no longer had a say in the matter. Resigning to his fate, he said, "My friends, I shall travel to Paris with my wife and my children. It is to the love of my good and faithful subjects that I entrust everything that is most precious to me." 3 years later, a massive procession set out from Versailles. Lafayette estimated the numbers to be about 60,000. Women, marching alongside the caravan, were cheering and singing, were bringing the baker, the baker's lad, and the baker's wife to Paris. This, of course, was a reference to the king, who was often referred to as the first baker of the kingdom. Once in Paris, the king was awarded the key to the city and was shown to the palace where he and his family would henceforth reside. The assembly proclaimed that King Louis XVI would no longer be known by the grand title of the King of France and of Navarre. Instead, he was simply to be Louis XVI, King of the French. This was all about the beginning of the French Revolution. This is an ongoing series, so stay tuned for the next part. If you want to add more information, or if you just want to correct my pronunciation, or if you just want to say hi, do make sure to make use of the comment section, do like, share and subscribe. That's all for today.